Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Tales Untold. Today we've got a short story, appropriately themed, given it is the Halloween season. This story is titled, Lights Out. You join me today in my closet, which I think is a very fitting setting. And this story, as with all of my stories that I share as part of this series, is written by me. The shades of the night will run from light. That's what Henry Jones' father had told him when he was a child. Never leave the light, boy, old Ben would say, hunched down to Henry's level. The shades will get you otherwise. And then his father would yell and startle him. It was a playful gesture, but the playfulness of his father's warning quickly disappeared when he proved it accurate. May the old man's soul rest in peace. Henry opened his eyes, banishing the memory as he gazed across the cloudy night. The shrinking remnants of the sun's light formed a small hill of blue on the otherwise dark horizon. The wind whipped Henry's curly gray hair across his wrinkled face. He knew he was overdue for a haircut, but free time was valuable in his line of work, and he knew he could wait another couple of weeks if he had to. Deep darkness surrounded Henry on all sides, but artificial white light illuminated him from below. He scanned the landscape, searching the shadows for movement or light, and was satisfied by the stillness that met his eyes. This might be a quieter night than most, he thought. He made for the ladder, holding on to the railing as he walked across the perimeter of the thin, steel tower. His stiff old legs were slow and unsteady, and so he placed each step with deliberation. It didn't help that the tower, only a little younger than he was, rocked ever so slightly from the wind. Henry reached the ladder and began to lower himself down. Samuel Weathers had installed this new ladder only a month ago, and so although the tower was unstable, he had no reason to suspect trouble from his descent. Even still, he took it slow, as he always had. There was nothing to be lost from being too careful. Once he reached the bottom, Henry hobbled over to the steel door of the bunker at the base of the tower. He intended to test its strength, but before he could give the hatch a heft, he felt something brush against his foot. Henry looked down. A thin, black cat with a pair of striking green eyes rubbed against his leg and gave out a scratchy mew. "Hello there, Noel," Henry smiled. Even 30 years of light housekeeping hadn't hardened him enough not to give his feline companion a verbal acknowledgement. He might have reached down to pet the creature, but his back unfortunately would not allow it. "Are you looking to join Samuel inside?" he asked. Noel looked up at him with expectant eyes. Henry wrenched the wheel on the front of the door around, and with a screech it gave. Orange light slipped through the crack in the door as Noel herself almost did the same, but stopped. She stared inside. Henry frowned. "Is everything all right?" Noel looked back up at him with an unreadable expression, then turned and walked off around the bunker. That was unusual, Henry knew. Usually the cat enjoyed spending her time inside, greeting their guests or sleeping in bed with Samuel. Henry turned his attention as he heard the faintest sound of conversation echoing from inside the bunker. That would be George McNabb engaging their latest traveler in conversation. He was an odd man, this traveler. Rather than using a vehicle as most people did, he had come in with nothing more than an oversized backpack and a string of light bulbs tied around his waist. He was also a picky eater. According to George, he had refused some perfectly good jerky, calling himself a vegetarian, whatever that meant. The idea that someone would ever refuse quality food on the basis of principle was baffling to Henry. Regardless, the man had paid well for his residency and hadn't caused any real trouble, and that was all this lighthouse wanted. Henry turned from the steel door and reached into his satchel, taking out his voltmeter as he made to complete the next task on his list. Around the lighthouse were situated 16 blindingly bright floodlights which formed a wall of electromagnetic radiation strong enough to expose anything that approached within 100 meters of the structure. They were placed close enough together that if any one light failed, the others could easily cover for it, and each light was powered separately for added reliability. The setup had been established since before Henry became a keeper here, but with Samuel's help, they had made some small improvements. With all their measures, Henry was positive that their lighthouse was one of the best protected in the entire country. Henry crouched near the first light, opening a hatch in its side. He reached the voltmeter inside, hooked it up to the wiring, adjusted some dials, and monitored the output. .1 ohms, it said, well under the ideal threshold. Henry rose with a grunt and moved on to the next light. It also displayed a satisfyingly low value. Henry tested the next, and then the next, and then the next, until he reached the 8th light. This particular light had been one of the most troublesome of the 16. Only a couple weeks ago, it had failed entirely. If not for their added security measures, Henry knew they would all be dead, like so many lighthouses before them. But they weren't. And although Samuel was able to get the light running again, afterwards it had remained unstable. Even as he looked, his voltmeter read a measly .5 ohms. Henry sighed. He drew up a quick note and left it in the hatch for Samuel to see on his next shift. All the rest of the border lights were working fine after that, thankfully, and Henry made back for the newly replaced ladder to return to the activity that took up the majority of his time, the watch. As long as Henry monitored the landscape, they wouldn't dare try anything. Up the ladder he went, and he made it halfway before he heard a sound. It was faint, and it came from below, a muted sound, a sound like a scream, or perhaps uproarious laughter. Henry paused, but before he had even stopped moving, the sound was gone. Only the breeze and the creaks of the tower met his ears. And so, Henry continued up the ladder. In early days he would have worried about these sorts of sounds, the unexpected sounds whose explanation did not come by sight. He used to raise the alarm for these, rushing inside to make sure all was okay. But it was always nothing. A dropped plate, a guest with an instrument, a louder than usual sneeze. He had learned to tune out those sounds and focus on what he could see. Besides, if he had been concerned about security, they only had one guest at the moment, and George MacNab had dealt with plenty far more troublesome individuals than this vegetarian in his past. Henry reached the top of the tower. He pulled himself up, guiding himself along the rails until he could stand safely. Then he surveyed the landscape once again. The clouds had only grown thicker since he'd last been up here, and he could feel growing moisture in the air. Rain seemed likely, although it was generally quite rare in this part of the country. Lightning was even less likely, but he never ruled anything out. Just in case, he granted a quick inspection to the lightning rod that formed the peak of the tower. It appeared fine. He glanced down the side of the tower, following the grounding wire as it snaked down to the base of the structure all the way to the ground. All appeared well. He was just about to check the radio antenna too while he was at it when he saw the door to the bunker slam open and someone run out. Henry tended to trust his eyes, but he knew that too many hours spent staring at darkness could cause him to see things on occasion. This, however, was certainly no vision. The figure, shirtless and clutching his torso, ran out into the floodlight, staggering at high speed away from the lighthouse, never faltering or looking back even for a moment. Henry watched him for another few seconds before his wits arrived to the occasion. "Hey," Henry called out. His voice was hoarse and the wind took half his volume. The figure made no appearance of having heard Henry and continued running into the distance. Soon he began to fade from view where the strength of the floodlights lessened. Henry called out a second time, louder, but received no reply, and in another moment the figure had completely disappeared. Henry took a moment to stare at the spot where the man had vanished, then cursed. "Moon's End," he muttered. If Henry couldn't see him, that meant they could. The man was as good as dead. Henry shifted his attention to the bunker and made for the ladder with haste, ignoring the cracking of his joints that came in the process. He descended, his breath picking up. Rung after rung, his old limbs complained, but he continued. He was almost wheezing by the time he reached the bottom of the ladder, where he paused, heaving, squinting again at the spot where the man had disappeared, then made straight for the open bunker door. He peeked inside. It was dark. That was the first and incredibly damning sign that something was wrong. The lights were never turned off inside the bunker, not even while people were sleeping. The fact they even had light switches at all was a leftover from the time before, and the only reason the lights were ever off was if the power had run out. But the border lights were still on, so the power had not been touched. Henry frowned, took out his small flashlight, and shined it into the entrance. Nothing appeared amidst the shadows of the coat room. There was a light switch right next to the front doorway, and Henry flipped it. The coat room was illuminated in an instant, and everything appeared to be well. 3 pairs of boots sat at the entrance, and 3 raincoats, one for Samuel, one for George, and one for the guests, hung on the rack. Henry wished he could guess who exactly had run outside, but this room provided no clues. Henry closed the door securely behind him and continued with caution into the following hallway. As he explored the interior, he flipped on every light he came across. Years of training and experience had told him to always be cautious around the darkness. "The shades of the night will run from light," his father's voice repeated in his head. There might not have been any of them in here, but other things could hide in the dark. His flashlight eventually came upon the entrance to the kitchen. As he approached, he did not immediately notice anything out of sorts, save for the quietness which seemed to sit upon the room. The smell of recently cooked bacon scented the air, reminding him of dinners past. The shadows lengthened upon the walls as he highlighted the dinner table in the middle of the room, freshly set for supper. His flashlight drifted right towards a massive backpack which sat on its side nearby, open, empty. Then his flashlight reached the ground and Henry froze. Below the table, a body lay prone on the ground, motionless in a pool of blood. Henry stared at the red-washed shape. The last time he had seen this much blood had been many, many years ago. His father had been there. Henry shuffled closer to the body to investigate, his legs even more unstable than usual. He was not able to avoid stepping in the crimson liquid on the floor, and he subconsciously noted that it was wet, very much fresh. He crouched down beside the body and rolled it over. Maybe he could place together what had happened if he could only identify the body had no face. In fact, it had no head at all. A red stump was all that remained. Henry pushed the corpse away and backed up, standing, quieting his quickened breath. Feeling an ever-growing weight in his chest, he shone his light towards the backpack, the only other item of note nearby. The interior of the backpack was large and completely hollow and, as he had noted a moment ago, entirely empty. It looked as if something large had been removed from the interior. Henry didn't bother to turn on the light in the kitchen. He didn't want to. He took 2 steps away towards the hallway when he heard a sound behind him. The sound was subtle, but the deafening silence of death made it far more audible. Henry whipped around and bathed the entrance hall in light. A black shape looked up at him, its wide green eyes displaying concern. Henry let out a deep breath. "Hello, Noel," he chuckled, but Noel did not acknowledge his greeting. The cat gazed not at him, but towards the hall where Henry had been headed, the hallway where Samuel was presumably sleeping and where their power generator resided. Henry turned in that direction, his smile converting into a grimace, and took a deep breath before moving away from his feline friend and towards the only remaining unsearched part of the house. As he approached the hallway, red footprints left in his wake, he noticed a mark on the wall. Henry squinted at it. A long horizontal slash marked where the faded wallpaper had peeled open. The wooden beam behind the wallpaper had been cut deep. Henry took another slow, deliberate breath as the weight in his chest grew somehow heavier. He had seen this sort of damage only once before, in the dark, as they chased. One of them slashed at his father and missed, slicing through a piece of furniture, leaving a similarly clean cut to what Henry now saw on the wall in front of him. This sort of damage was not easily carried out by a human tool or weapon. Henry raised his flashlight towards the hallway ahead of him. The first door he approached was on the bedroom where Samuel slept. The 2 of them took shifts each day, one resting while the other watched. While Henry and Samuel kept watch, George took care of everything else. Such was their routine, carried out for years on end to ensure that the lighthouse remained safe. When Henry aimed his flashlight inside the room, to his dismay, he discovered his second corpse of the day. A body sat on the ground next to the bed, some of its limbs still tangled up with the red-soaked sheets. The corpse's pajamas and the carpet on which it sat shared the same stained red color. One of Samuel's limbs was no longer attached to his body. Henry squeezed his eyes shut and aimed his flashlight away towards the next room down the hall, the power room. His handheld light was not steady as he took his first couple steps, and then all the lights went out. Henry immediately turned and stumbled into the kitchen, ignoring the blood on the ground as he rounded the table and hobbled towards the counter. He threw himself into the corner of the room and turned. From this angle he could view both the hallway and the entrance hall, the 2 directions from which he knew they would come. His light flashed between the 2 routes of entry as his heart rate picked up and the weight in his chest threatened to pull him to the ground. Images and sounds filled his mind. They were chasing, they attacked, they missed. Henry and his father ran. His father threw him into the room and shut the door in his face. There was a scream which cut off quickly. Henry fumbled in the drawers of the storeroom and took out the extra flashlight, aiming it towards the door as, "Henry!" The voice came from the hallway. Henry hyperventilating, snapped the light in that direction. "Henry, do not shine the lights on me." "Who are you?" Henry shouted. His voice sounded like he hadn't talked above a whisper for over a week. "I am the Shade. I am in the room with the stone." The stone? The power stone? The creature was in the power room. It must have taken the power stone out of the generator. That explained why the lights had gone out. But if the power was out, that meant... "I have turned off the border lights," the voice whispered. "My friends will soon arrive." Henry aimed the light back at the entrance hall. Noel's small shape ran out of the hallway, slipping past his light, and hid under the table, melting into the darkness. Henry pointed his light back towards the hallway where the Shade was hidden. "As I said, do not shine the lights at me. Look away from me, and let me leave, and we will leave you alone." The creature's tone was flat. "You killed them!" Henry screamed like a child. "I killed your friends, yes, but they would have stopped what we were trying to do." "What do you want? How did you get in here?" Henry's legs almost gave out. The sound of scraping metal followed by a crash came from the front entrance. Henry swung the light in that direction briefly before aiming it back down the hall to the power room. His flashlight saw nothing but blackness. "Jace let me in. We asked him to do it before we arrived here. I only want the stone. Please let me leave now." "You can't have it." Henry got up with effort and began to inch towards the kitchen counter. A knife block sat next to the sink. Henry kept his eyes towards the hallway and exit as he reached and fumbled for the largest knife's handle. "If you do not let me leave, then you have decided to die. Please aim your flashlight away and allow us to kill you in peace." Henry drew the knife, pointed it towards the shadows, planted his feet, and gritted his teeth. "No. Very well." A hissing came from the hallway. The sound was followed by a similar hissing coming from the entrance. Then, in a flash, shapes exploded from both routes. Henry caught the shapes that appeared from the entrance hall, his beam capturing something that he could only describe as a muddy shadow with limbs. It vibrated and hissed loudly as it froze in the light. Then something flashed into his vision from the left, and a limb of some sort swung at him in a fluid motion. Henry had no time to react as his left arm, flashlight in hand, was struck. It and his flashlight fell to the ground with a thump and clatter. Henry screamed and swung his knife. He caught the creature in the chest, but it did not react. It attacked again, and Henry was thrown to the ground, his last defense getting out of reach. Henry backed himself into the corner, hyperventilating, crying as he grasped in desperation for what remained of his limb. The hissing grew louder as the creatures descended on him, and in Henry's last moments he barely heard the Shade's final words to him. "This never needed to happen." Henry closed his eyes. And there you go. That was Lights Out, a short story by myself. I hope you enjoyed. I hope I maybe made you a little scared. And happy Halloween. Around the lighthouse were situated 16 blindingly bright floodlights, which formed a wall of electromagnetic radiation strong enough to expose anything that... What a sentence. God, why do you write them so long?